Greetings, comrades! Victory Day is approaching, probably the most important holiday in modern Russian history. And, similar to last year, I would like to dedicate a separate video to this day. In today's video, I would like to talk about those who are sometimes overlooked when people remember this victory. I am talking about the women of the Soviet Union, who fought alongside the men in this terrible war. Yes, I guess you all know those popular stories about Soviet female snipers or about night witches, but that's pretty much it. Meanwhile, according to various estimates, between 500,000 and 1 million women fought in the ranks of the Soviet army during the Second World War. So today I would like to talk about them.
Граждане и гражданки Советского Союза, сегодня в 4 часа утра.
As it happened, the Soviet Union was pretty much the only country during World War II where women were directly involved in combat. The Soviet Union differed greatly from Britain, the United States or Germany in that regard, where women were assigned almost exclusively to non-combat roles: administrators, nurses, truck drivers, mechanics, electricians and auxiliary pilots. Of course, first of all, this was due to the enormous human losses of the USSR during the war, especially those of 1941-1942. However, there is a second reason. We shouldn't forget that the Soviet Union was one of the countries where the ideas of first waves of feminism found the most ardent support. In fact, during the 20th century, the USSR was probably the most progressive country in terms of equality between women and men. In many respects, this was the reason why women in the USSR volunteered for the army and insisted on being sent to the battlefield. But let us talk about those without whose efforts victory in the war would also have been impossible. About the home front workers. It is no secret that the USSR was approaching the war with Germany not in the best conditions. Their industrial production was inferior to that of their rival in many spheres. In addition, because of the fast pace of German advance into the European part of the USSR, the country's leadership was forced to move a significant number of large enterprises and industrial giants with their workforce to the east of the country as quickly as possible. Imagine, entire giant factories were relocated thousands of kilometers inland, to the Volga region, the Urals and western Siberia. With the onset of the German invasion, up to 80% of the male population left to fight the aggressor. According to estimates, the number of men in the national economy of Russia by autumn of 1942 fell from 22.2 million to 9.5 million. Accordingly, it was women and adolescents who had to maintain the economic viability of the country. Women had to take care of their households, grow agricultural products, work behind the machines and workbenches at the weapon factories. Even traditionally male activities, such as felling timber or mining coal, had to be carried out by women. At the same time, the country lived under the laws of wartime. The working day was extended and compulsory overtime shifts were introduced. In food and light industries, the proportion of women during the war years was 80 to 95%. In the transport industry, more than 40% of workers were women by the summer of 43. Thus, the number of women among steam engine operators increased from 6% in 1941 to 33% at the end of 1942. Among compressor operators, from 27% to 44%. Among metal turners, from 16% to 33%. Welders, 17 to 31%. Locksmiths, 3.9% to 12%. By the end of the war, women in the RSFSR accounted for 59% of workers and employees of the Republic, instead of 41% in 1940. Some enterprises where only men had worked before the war employed up to 70% of women. Besides that, those same women who happened to be near the front line had to take care of the economic provision of the quartered regiments. Sometimes they had to perform some dangerous tasks. They had to dig trenches and anti-tank ditches, often directly under constant bombardment by Nazi planes. And it was these women, working in horrible conditions, who became some of the architects of the final victory of the Soviet Union. Since 1939, the People's Commissariats of Defense and the Navy had the right to recruit women with medical, veterinary and special technical training into the Army and Navy, as well as to involve them in training camps. In wartime, women with the above training could be enlisted in the army and navy to perform auxiliary and special services. So after the announcement of the beginning of the war, many women went to the party and Komsomol organizations, citing this article and demanded sending them to the battlefront. Among volunteers who applied during the first days of the war for sending to the army in the field, up to 50% of applications were made by women. However, women were added to the troops gradually. Only healthy women aged no younger than 18 were subject to mobilization. Everything was taken into account: education, preferably at least 5 to 7 grades finished, membership in the Komsomol, health, absence of children. Many, however, were not deterred by these requirements. Lots of girls ran away from home to become volunteers before they turned 18. The result was an interesting situation in which basically only the best of the best women were drafted, while men were drafted without much selection. Mass conscription, however, did not begin until the spring of 1942. The original purpose of the voluntary female mobilization was to replace men in those places where they could be replaced, for example as communication operators, mechanics and drivers. Those men in turn could have been sent to the battlefield. But just 3 months later, women began to take a full part in combat operations. They dived bombers, drove tanks, provided fire cover for air defense. They performed reconnaissance, participated in partisan detachments in the occupied territories, were sailors and snipers. I have already said that you probably know about 3 all-female aviation regiments, one of which was nicknamed the Night Witches. But there were also female snipers, female sailors, even female tank drivers. For example, 4 all-women tank crews took part in the famous Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943. And believe me, to operate a Soviet tank back then, you had to have an enormous muscle power. 80,000 women became officers in the Soviet army. About 100 women received the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, most of them posthumously. And of course, we cannot forget about hundreds of thousands of female medics who risked themselves daily at the front of the Second World War. Of the total number of doctors in the Red Army, 41% were women. Among the surgeons, the percent was about 44%, and among nurses they were almost 100%. And this activity was almost more dangerous than the direct participation in military operations for ordinary soldiers. After all, injured soldiers had to be dragged from the front line and taken to the hospital. That's what nurses had to do, pulling the wounded from the battlefield under the bullets and shrapnel. It is not surprising that according to the studies in 1943, battlefield nurses had the highest rate of injuries among all military professions. All this is combined with the fact that it was mainly young girls who went to the front. The majority of them was from 16 to 18 years old. They basically had to grow up on the battlefield. And they were the ones who had to endure all the horrors of the war to the fullest. The fates of women during the war unfolded in different ways, often tragically. Unfortunately, Soviet women were not always perceived as true heroes of the Second World War. The first research works on women's participation in the Great Patriotic War began to appear only in the 1960s. The Soviet Union did not even keep records of the number of women killed or wounded in the war. They were only recorded in the overall figures, not singled out separately. So I can't even say exactly how many women have fallen on the battlefields of this war. The fates of women after the war also developed differently. In general, the topic of post-war rehabilitation of women soldiers is very complex. The memory of women's heroism during the war was consigned to oblivion for a very long time. Even female veterans themselves told how they were embarrassed to talk about the fact that they had fought in the war. This was shaped by the negative attitudes in society, which relied on various stories about marching wives. These stories somehow cast a shadow over all the women who fought in a war. When they came home, unfortunately, all sorts of unpleasant things sometimes were said about them. And usually they came from the mouths of women who had remained at home. And also from the men, many of whom treated them with contempt. not considering them to be real veterans. This was even emphasized by the war movies of the 40s and 50s. Women in these movies only played the role of the loving wife, faithfully waiting for her husband from the front. They had to be feminine, filled with duty, joy, loyalty and support. Even if they had to go one-on-one with the enemy, they still had to look like a model. Not a single word about the fact that women could endure the hardships of war on an equal footing with men. It was not until the 1970s that Soviet films began to show women more often exactly as they were in the war, and exactly as they returned from it. There are some films about women who were traumatized by the drama of the war and could not find themselves in everyday life after. And it is much closer to the way things were in the real world. Many women soldiers came back with health problems and were unable to have children, for example the snipers. They were lying in the snow sometimes for days, suffered joint face wounds, were affected by PTSD. It was very hard for them to return to normal life after that. These women have been through a lot, but instead of gratitude, they received spits in their faces or insults behind their backs. So at least now I would like people to remember them with great respect and appreciation.